Hello and welcome to our presentation, What Happens to Risk Perception of Environmental Issues During a Global Pandemic. During this presentation, we'll be talking to you about risk perception of sea level rise and the novel coronavirus. Before we start, let me introduce our research team. Shumaila Bhatti, Kimberly Korioth, Paige, Restivo, and Brittany Wong will be talking to you during this presentation. My name is Silje Kristiansen, and we are all from the State University of New York, from the College of Environmental Science and Forestry. We'll be very happy to take any questions and comments that you might have. Thank you.
I'm going to introduce you a bit more to our topic and our paper. So we are, of course, living in a climate crisis. Therefore, it's important to study risk perception and people's willingness to act on climate change as a way to get people more motivated and engaged with the topic. Sea level rise, of course, is one big impact of climate change, and it's affecting communities across the world, both those along the coast who are experiencing flooding and those further upland who are taking on everyone moving back from shorelines. So we decided to explore how students from inland and coastal communities perceive risk of sea level rise differently. We started by taking a look at students in Syracuse, New York, where our university, SUNY ESF, is located, and also students in Kingstown, Rhode Island. Now you might be thinking, why did we choose Rhode Island? Well, Rhode Island has over 400 plus miles of coastline, and it's very low-lying, so it's experiencing a lot of flooding because of climate change. You can see here Hurricane Sandy in North Kingstown, Rhode Island, and just how much flooding happens during that one event. On top of all of this, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, which, though it's been very unfortunate that it's been happening, at the same time, it's given us a unique perspective, a chance to compare risk perception for these two different topics, the long-term sea level rise and the more short-term immediate COVID-19 pandemic. So therefore, our study grew to incorporate studying risk perception and willingness to act for these two very pressing topics, and also taking a look at different factors that play into those things. I talked about location already, but there's also knowledge, past impact, and demographics as well.
Before we delve into risk perception of climate change, it's important to talk about what risk perception is in general. That can be illustrated in the visual that's on the right-hand side. So risk is a multidimensional construct and consists of possible trade-offs, but also possible benefits. These dimensions, together with the probability for them to occur, their severity or degree, and the uncertainty connected to them, are weighed in when people make a decision of whether or not to engage in a risk. Furthermore, to speak about specifically risk perception of climate change, it can be seen in a study that was conducted by the Yale program on climate change communication that 67% of adult Americans believe that global warming is happening, while only 42% of adult Americans think global warming will harm them personally. It can be visualized on the graphic on the right-hand side. Furthermore, risk perception of climate change is commonly and heavily associated with a person's beliefs or knowledge. That can be discussed within the Yale program of climate change communications research as well. It is believed that risk perception and education are heavily correlated, and that speaks about how higher educated populations are believed to have a greater risk perception of climate change or sea level rise. That can be seen in the graphic on the right-hand side from Sunblad and Garling 2007 that shows that knowledge is a huge factor in effective risk judgment. In another paper from Lee et al., it can be also seen that they believe that different levels of education about climate change and sea level rise is critical in shaping responses to risk. And this idea can be seen depicted from a graphic that I created that says that it's believed that higher education or even living on the coast will lead to greater knowledge of climate issues, and thus will lead to people being more willing to change their behaviors to mitigate climate change. However, there are people who oppose this idea, and it can be seen in Ludi and Condolf 2012 that shows that there 70% of respondents had a 4-year university degree or higher, but did not understand the risk of flooding in a 100-year floodplain area, and this was taking place in Sacramento, California. Later, it can be seen in other papers, and overall, the idea is summarized that higher education may not be the only factor in changing people's perspectives on climate change and issues related to climate. So therefore, there could be other ideas that are influential in risk perception of sea level rise, and specification of degree may be one of those, and we will get into that in the results section.
So another topic we looked at in our literature review was risk perception and its connection to location, coastal versus non-coastal. And there were a few key takeaways. First and foremost, we found that those who are actually further away from the coast perceived risk as a lot more severe than those who were right up along the coast, experiencing a local sea level rise issue. This was shown in Spence and Pigeon 2010 and Wretches 2017. This is mainly due to something called aversive arousal, which was identified in Brugger et al. 2015. And this is basically the desire to avoid thinking about negative things happening in your own community, which leads to denial of the problem. Brody et al. In 2008 provided a little bit more detail, essentially saying that those who were right up along the coast actually had pretty high risk perception because they were right in that sea level rise inundation zone. But those who are a little bit further back in the floodplain, who might be affected by, say, sea level rise plus an 100-year storm, they perceive their risk from sea level rise as low, which is very problematic. We also explored knowledge, willingness to act, and location, coastal versus non-coastal. And we mainly found through Covey and Kane 2016 that those presented with local information actually have a lot less knowledge retention than those who were presented with a distant scenario. And this makes a lot of sense because seeing something like that happen in your own community is very scary. We also found in that Covey and Kane paper that those presented with local sea level rise information tended to focus on action-oriented solutions, protect, accommodation, and retreat strategies. So here we're talking about seawalls, wetland restorations, all of these different things that communities might come together to do to prevent flooding. On the other hand, those who are a little bit further away advocated for policy-based interventions. So changes in zoning regulation, riparian zone setbacks, all of these things. And this was in McDonald 2016. Finally, along with this, Shute et al. 2017 noted that localization of climate change does not create increased policy support, only more concrete language around the topic, which makes a lot of sense with those who are local preferring action strategies and those further away preferring policy strategies. We also took a look at risk perception and past impact or experience with a climate change event, and we found that personal experience with a natural disaster has the largest impact on risk perception compared to all other contributing factors. This was found in Luhala et al. 2015. And alongside this, simply living in an area prone to natural hazards does not influence increased risk perception. You need both living in that coastal area and also having experience with a flood event in order to have the heightened risk perception overall. Also, we found that personal experience with the effects of climate change led to increased belief in climate change and also increased belief in policy to combat climate change. However, it changed a little bit depending on the type of effect of climate change you were experiencing. So in Whitmarsh 2008, they found that belief in climate change is driven by experience with things such as air pollution, but not necessarily with experience with flooding. You can see in this diagram here how that all plays out, right? So if you have a flood event, you might be left thinking, we're having drainage issues, we need to have better stormwater management tools. But if you're having an air pollution event, you might be saying, look at all the smog, we need to get our emissions under control so that our children and elderly don't start having health issues. So just having a closer connection to emissions and all of these things driving climate change helps people kind of piece it together a little bit more quickly.
The next topic that our research team looked at for our study is how risk perception influences willingness to act. To start off, there has been very little research on the correlation between risk perception and willingness to act, leading to gaps between behavioral intentions and willingness to act. In many situations, communicators are looking to influence people's actions. A prerequisite to behavioral change is the willingness to change and act. A situation and its external forces can alter behavior of individuals who are involved in them. These include antecedents, cues that precede behavior, and the consequences that reward or punish. Behavior in situations also has its consequences that can either add or take away from the situation. Rewarding consequences are reinforcers because they strengthen or increase the behavior. In this instance, many factors play a role in convincing people to take action on environmental issues such as sea level rise and climate change. The psychological motives, such as the motive of choice in terms of equity and efficiency, are important because choices that benefit the environment are what drive environmental change. Technical solutions cannot discharge the responsibility of making beneficial environmental choices. Others have also pointed out that barriers to action such as uncertainty and ignorance may disrupt the pathway between risk perception and behavioral intentions or willingness to act. Many of the studies in this field have linked willingness to act to radon testing in homes due to similar characteristics as climate change. However, many scholars have migrated to linking environmental beliefs and intentions. Studies have also shown in regards to students that female students are more willing to act to mitigate climate change than male students. Finally, the link between interest in environmental issues and willingness to act in climate change mitigation has shown that environmental interest positively relates to beneficial environmental behavior as well as parental engagement in developing the beneficial environmental behavior.
So after all of this literature review regarding sea level rise and climate change disasters, we started to focus also on medical disasters. And the first key difference that we wanted to point out was in terms of timelines, right? So for sea level rise, this is something occurring over like 100 years, right? So for Rhode Island, you have 1.67 feet of sea level rise in 2030, all the way up to 9.6 feet of sea level rise in 2100. COVID-19, on the other hand, has moved much more quickly. So the virus was, of course, identified in December 2019, and as of June 2020, there have been 500,000 deaths globally. So what do we know in regards to medical disasters in terms of risk, knowledge, and willingness to act? Well, first of all, we know that effective response impacts evaluations and compliance with recommended behaviors, so that willingness to act is affected. This was determined in Bhatti et al. 2010. We also know that increased trust of government, risk perception, perceived vulnerability, and receipt of information all impact intent to adopt protective measures, which was found in van der Weerde et al. 2011. Further, information is most trusted coming from a personal health provider, a physician, or the media, and education level and cultural beliefs impact willingness to adopt preventative measures as well, as determined in Silje et al. 2007.
Based on the research provided in our literature review, our research team created 4 research questions. Are people who are living in coastal areas due to sea level rise more aware, knowledgeable, worried, and willing to act compared to people who are living further away from the coast? Are people who have been personally impacted by sea level rise more aware, knowledgeable, worried, and willing to act compared to people who have not been personally impacted? Are people who are more knowledgeable about sea level rise more worried and willing to act on climate change? And the 4th is, how does demographic characteristics such as age, gender, political affiliation, etc., influence awareness, knowledge, worry, otherwise known as risk perception, and willingness to act? We conducted our study in 2 communities, as mentioned before, located in the Northeast region of the United States of America. Kingstown, Rhode Island is the home of the main campus for the University of Rhode Island, and Syracuse, New York, which is the home of the main campuses of SUNY ESF and Syracuse University. Study participants include the student body at both the University of Rhode Island, as well as the student body at both SUNY ESF and Syracuse University. All of the students that participated in the study are at least 18 years of age or older. The survey that we created captures various categories, testing various components in relation to sea level rise and the most recent issue of the COVID-19 pandemic. The types of questions that were asked in the survey were risk perception questions, information source questions, knowledge questions, awareness questions, willingness to act questions, and socio-demographic questions. And as you notice in the figure on the right, that is an actual screenshot from the survey that the students filled out. Our data collection protocol included recruitment tactics such as sending emails to numerous student organizations, institution faculty, and students from each of the institutions to engage and encourage them to participate in the survey over the time period that the survey was open. Data collected from the students' answers were then put into a spreadsheet in order to be analyzed. The data was then analyzed from the spreadsheet into the R software. Regression equations were then created and sorted in regards to awareness, impact, location, demographics, and knowledge for both sea level rise and the COVID pandemic. The next slide is the summary statistics of our sample size by region. If you would like to look at the numbers more in depth, feel free to pause the video right here before continuing on to the results section of the video.
So now we're going to get into our results. We'll be starting by talking about sea level rise and coastal versus non-coastal location. Before I get into this, I'll say that all of our results are going to be shown in this box plot format. So you'll see a thicker bold line, that is our median, the dot in the middle is our mean, the H-shaped area is our standard error bars, and the box is the 25 to 75 percentile. And as you can see on this slide, impact or personal experience with sea level rise events was influenced by coastal versus non-coastal location, which makes a lot of sense. Those in coastal areas were more likely to experience the impact of sea level rise. Surprisingly, risk perception, knowledge, and willingness to act were not influenced by coastal versus non-coastal location. And you can see some of those graphs here. Now, for these results for sea level rise, you will see risk index divided between personal and impersonal. Personal refers to what someone believes that their risk is to sea level rise, whereas impersonal is the world's risk or others' risks of sea level rise. All right, and then we have COVID-19, coastal versus non-coastal. We found actually no significant findings, no differences between coastal and non-coastal in terms of risk, knowledge, willingness to act, any of these things with COVID-19. And you can see these graphs here. We've divided it into the 3 categories for COVID-19 based on our survey questions, and you can see no significant difference between these.
So for our sea level rise results, people identifying as females and others had significantly higher personal and impersonal risk perception based on the risk indices and showed significantly greater willingness to act compared to those identifying as males. As you can see here, there was no significant impact with regards to impact and knowledge. Gender played an important role in risk perception and willingness to act for COVID-19 as well. Those identifying as females and others reported significantly higher risk and willingness to act with regards to COVID-19 compared to men in the study, whereas knowledge was not significantly different between the genders.
We also took a look at political affiliation, and for this, we've determined that for sea level rise, personal risk perception, impersonal risk perception, and willingness to act were all influenced by political affiliation, whereas impact and knowledge were not influenced. And you can see in the graphs here, Democrats and independents were shown to have statistically more impersonal risk, personal risk, and willingness to act in comparison to Republicans. In terms of COVID-19, we determined that risk perception was influenced by political affiliation, where knowledge and willingness to act were not. And you can see this in the accompanying graphs as well, that Democrats and independents were shown to have statistically higher risk index than Republicans.
When discussing the results of sea level rise and the correlation with level of education attained, you can see that only impact and willingness to act have significance in the data. And this goes against some of the literature review that was in the paper that shows that level of education has a significant impact on whether somebody perceives risk of climate change or sea level rise. When talking about COVID-19, however, the risk index is the only area where there's significant significance in the data. And this is correlated, as we'll see later, with the degree. For results of sea level rise and specialization of degree, you can see that there are more areas where there's significance in the data. Something to note is that some people may have gone into the fields that they've chosen because they've been impacted by sea level rise in their hometowns or areas. And this is something that we may not know, and just something to keep in the back of our minds when reviewing the data. And this is interesting because it sides with the part of the literature review that shows that just solely the degree and level of education that someone has is not enough to impact their perception of risk and understanding of sea level rise. As I mentioned previously, for the COVID-19, the specialization of degree, you can see that only the risk index can be seen with significance in the data.
Another important finding from our study was that people living in non-coastal area were significantly more worried about COVID-19 than they were worried about sea level rise. However, people in the coastal area were worried about both COVID-19 and sea level rise. In the next slide, we will be talking about developing our regression model. So for the regression, we use the leaps function in R Studio to identify the best fit variables for each of the models created. We created 4 models. 1, we were predicting the risk index personal for sea level rise. 2, risk index personal for COVID-19. 3rd, willingness to act for sea level rise and willingness to act for COVID-19. Our criteria for the best model was to use adjusted R squared. We use adjusted R squared because for the simple multiple R squared, the more variables you include in your regression model, the bigger the multiple R squared is going to be. However, adjusted R squared adjusts itself for the number of variables that you add. So for the first model, we have the adjusted R square 0.42. This was the highest that we could achieve with the given variables. The variables highlighted in pink are the ones that had the most impact on the risk index. The estimate over here is actually the beta value. Through this, we can find out that willingness to act and risk index impersonal, along with politics, had the significantly higher impact on the predictive variable that is the risk index. Our second model talks about predicting willingness to act with regards to sea level rise. Over here, we can see again, just like Kim previously mentioned in our literature review, we found out that willingness to act and risk perception had a very strong correlation. Risk index impersonal and personal both had a very strong impact on the willingness to act. Over here, I adjusted R squared at 0.338. And gender also played a significant role, as we have previously shown through the box plots. Our third model is predicting risk index for COVID-19. Again, the risk perception was one of the factors that was significantly contributing the most to COVID-19 risk. Others like gender and school also played an important role. Last model is predicting COVID-19, willingness to act, and in that, risk again played the biggest contribution to willingness to act, and politics and gender were the 2 other things that had a very strong impact as well. So the main takeaways of our study are as follows. Coastal folks are equally worried about both COVID-19 and sea level rise, whereas non-coastal folks' main concern right now is COVID-19. main factors impacting willingness to act for sea level rise in COVID-19 are gender, political affiliation, which is similar to risk perception. However, specialization also plays a major role in risk perception. This also includes those who are impacted, who have shown higher risk perception. Ordinary least square regression model showed a very strong correlation between willingness to act and risk. Our results suggest that communicators need to convey the urgency of climate change so that those who have the resources will be more willing to take action to lessen the footprint. Thank you for your attention. These are our contact information, and these are the references. Thank you so much for listening.